So implications for research. Any research methodology has to incorporate the way that the informal economy is represented, and it has to incorporate this sort of lack of agency, within policy in particular. There's a very, very weak voice of the participants within the informal economy, and how do you try to overcome that? How do you include that voice in policy and so on? So the issue of representation, and there are certain things that we can start to do in terms of researchers' reflexivity and how we understand these sort of wider geopolitical relationships and how they affect the way that we see things like the informal economy, how we see Africa. Africa as a Western invention, if you like, and seen in a pejorative way. And also involves informal sector actors' capabilities of resisting those representations. So, to what extent, and this is always the problem as a cross-cultural researcher that I've got, I think, is in terms of when I'm studying Africans, to put it crudely, to what extent am I getting good answers, to the extent that am I simply getting a mirror image back at me in terms of my representations and sort of wider representations of Africans? So, to what extent is Western management principles and practices relevant to your work? Yes, it's very relevant because, to what extent is there resistance to this dominant view, this sort of dominant, modernizing view of Western management, for example, within the informal economy? So, how does this work out within the informal economy? Are these representations resisted? And to what extent do, let's say, informal economy participants being involved in wider associations, national, international, to what extent does that actually strengthen those representations or weaken those representations? It could go either way. So these are big questions and not necessarily knowing how to answer them at this stage. But also, Briggs and Sharp, warn against this, that simply, and also the issue of indigenous, the indigenous, it's like the Hofstede thing again, a culture, it's not just static, it doesn't just stay there. It's not an artifact, it's not a thing, it changes all the time. So it's actually conceptualizing that indigenous aspect within a wider theory, and something like post-colonial theory. After all, it's that in itself is evolved out of a post-colonial situation. It's another claim for a globalized theory, if you like. But how does that globalized theory interact with the view of things like the indigenous? And I think there's a necessity to have a wider theory there. But there's also a necessity to incorporate an indigenous view within that wider theory. So, it's complicated. Again, it's complicated. And the other aspect, the agency of the informal economy in actually being able to change things. Research which doesn't include the active participation of actors within the informal economy is probably flawed. You have to involve people. And there is, and I know, through working with the whole number of different African managers, staffs, and so on, and also co-researchers, that there's this awful problem of deference. You're the Western researcher. You know everything, and getting people to change things, getting people to change questionnaires, even. At a very sort of basic level, and one example that I'd like to use is our researcher in Rwanda, and the questionnaire. This was a sort of very broad-based management questionnaire that we put across, through different collaborators in 15 sub-Saharan countries, and one of the questions was about ethnicity, and we asked that in terms of home language, and how would you regard your culture. And this researcher got arrested because you're not allowed to ask those questions in Rwanda. And it's just a matter of not looking at this critically, and she did get released quite quickly, and she'd explained. But it's this sort of deference. So it is a real problem. So how do you get around that? So, really what we need to be thinking of is participatory methods and how we can get people to better represent themselves and so on. And this, I like this, again, this is an indirect quote, if you like, from Briggs and Sharp, but this is an indigenous worker, if you like, Hooks, a feminist worker, who I can't remember the reason, but spells her name with a lowercase h. No need to hear your voice when I can talk about you better than you can speak about yourself. No need to hear your voice. Only tell me about your pain. I want to know your story, and then I will tell it back to you in a new way. It's this sort of idea of getting people to represent themselves. But if you represent yourself, then I've got to then translate that. And I've got to retell it to you, but not just to you. I've got to retell it to an international audience so that they understand it in a scientific way. And this is the problem that we have to try to overcome. One of the things that I like to do, because I've spoken a lot about sort of these dynamics and geopolitical dynamics, and there's no such thing as the informal worker working in a vacuum. It goes back to, again, to this idea of the indigenous or, the sort of traditional social anthropological study. And, I studied social anthropology at undergraduate level in the 1970s, and it was all about Africa. And it was all about isolated cultures, and they didn't interact with the rest of the world. But, you've got to start to look at where these, what these interactions are. And as I was saying, there's no such thing as the isolated informal worker or entrepreneur operating in a complete vacuum. There's a network around them. And it's not just a dyadic relationship. It's not just, something that you can do in terms of stakeholder analysis or whatever. You need to do a wider network analysis. You need to see outside just purely a one-to-one relationship and what those relationships are with, not just things like tax authorities, but ultimately there's a lot of interest in terms of, international funders and how they impact on policy, et cetera, et cetera. So actually mapping out what these relationships are, and not just in a structural way, but also in a phenomenological way, in terms of what are the ideologies passing backwards and forwards, what are the results and so on. So, you have to somehow map this out. Establish participatory processes and methods, which I mentioned before, and how you go about doing that, and trying to develop relationships which encourage people to speak out. And it's quite interesting, some of the stuff, because before this project, and I'm still doing this to a certain extent, is looking at projects in HIV/AIDS and looking at the sort of international local relationships through a cross-cultural management approach of projects and programs in HIV/AIDS in Southern Africa. And it's quite interesting that one of the approaches that one of the colleagues in South Africa was using were visual methods, giving women in townships cameras to try and better represent themselves. If you think about there's a big industry called, well, I would call it loosely the international development industry. It's worth £100 billion at the moment, and that's just sort of official overseas development aid. It doesn't incorporate all the sort of the unseen funds of the big NGOs and so on. So an industry worth £100 billion, which is probably is self-perpetuating in the sense that all the images that we see on the television about Africa, that's the representation of people with HIV/AIDS and women in townships and so on. That's the squalor and the hassles and the problems and the negatives and so on. But how do people then counter that? It's a little voice even, but how can and sometimes illiterate people, how do they counter that? So, some of these studies, and Molet Zami, who's a colleague of mine in Durban, looking at visual methods. You probably know the stuff, Sarah Pink. Do you know Sarah Pink's stuff? Visual anthropology. But Mulitsani is sort of working with people, just, you know, sort of simple things like giving them cameras and getting them to represent themselves, and, you know, how would you represent yourself? But it's difficult amongst, you know, if you've got to counter this, you know, this $100 billion industry that wants to represent you in a particular way, and actually trying to counter that. So how useful is that likely to be in the informal economy? And establishing means and methods of articulation and reporting of research. You know, why do you report research? You know, okay, we need our REF articles, but, you know, how else do you report research? You know, for what? For what reason? Who do you report it to? For you know, for what reasons, etc., etc. You know, can this inform you know, practitioner questions like how do we better develop skills and so on in the informal economy, in our organisations, given the lack of resources, etc., etc. So it's how you disseminate this, it's what you do with it. So I'll finish there. If you want a copy of these slides, I'm sure we can supply them to you.
A copy of this presentation, so with Terence permission,